Despite the concept of therapeutic use of self, and I'm going to say this phrase a lot in this video, being quite an important part of OT practice, according to Taylor and colleagues, it is considered to be the least understood as well. Why is this topic so important and not just a concept to, say, quickly learn to pass on your exam and forget about and believe that you mastered? Well, a survey in 2003 that sampled 129 OTs found that 96% deemed occupational therapy, the therapeutic relationship, to be critical to functional performance, with another study with over 90% also agreeing that there is a relationship between the therapeutic relationship and occupational engagement. Disappointingly, though, one study found that only half of participants felt that their education prepared them in utilizing their use of self as a therapeutic tool. Even worse, less than 5% didn't receive any training at all or exposure to this important concept at all. After watching this video, you will learn its definition, the theory behind it, why therapists like occupational therapists practice the therapeutic use of self, and how to put it all into practice. Let's get functional. Occupational therapy is an evidence-based, unique profession that blends both science and art. And a term or concept or approach, whatever you want to call it, is the therapeutic use of self, which also blends the both. It may seem like the therapeutic use of self is much of an art, but it actually is both science and art, as you will see based on the theory. Throughout this video, I encourage you to question and reflect how this may be the case as we learn about the therapeutic use of self. Before I go into the higher level definition, and there's going to be several of these, I thought it would be more helpful to describe it first, like how I would describe it to a child before using all of these fancy words and phrases. The therapeutic use of self is when someone helps other people, like a therapist or a teacher, uses their feelings and personality to help other people feel better. They are really good listeners and they try to understand how someone else feels. They use their own experiences and feelings to help the other person understand their own feelings better. They then try to make the other person feel safe and comfortable and help them to learn new things or do new things and make them feel better about the things that they want to do. So what I essentially described here for the therapeutic use of self are the concepts of 1, being client-centered, 2, being collaborative, 3, listening, 4, empathy, 5, compassion, 6, safety and comfort, but also not mentioned but implied is our professional reasoning, what was once referred to as, clinical reasoning. You're likely to be already familiar with these terms that I mentioned and their meaning, as they are quite universal to everyday language, and common concepts also like client-centered and collaboration in OT are pretty well understood and intuitive as well. Fun fact, in a survey of therapists in 2003, 99% identified empathy as a critical component for the therapeutic relationship to promote positive outcomes. So keep that in the back of your head. One common place that the therapeutic use of self appears is in the AOTA's practice framework. So this means that it is an important concept, and it's also where you can reference it too. According to the AOTA, this concept is considered to be an integral part of the OT processes, part of the therapeutic relationship. By the way, both occupational therapists and occupational therapy assistants can and should use this approach in practice. This also kind of implies that students should do so as well. So start early and start practicing your therapeutic use of self as soon as you learn about it in school. Putting it all together, based on my simple definition earlier and the concepts that kind of described, the OTPF actually defines that the therapeutic use of self is a process in which OT practitioners develop and manage their therapeutic relationship with clients. They do it by using professional reasoning, empathy, and a client-centered collaborative approach to service delivery. Okay, cool. So some of the things that we already heard about earlier. But actually, a more commonly used definition for this process that I don't think is mentioned in the OTPF is that from Poonwar and Pelequin in 2000. And I like it more because it's broader and just more intuitive to understand and remember too. It's the use of one's personality, insights, perceptions, and judgments as part of the therapeutic process. And these terms may seem quite intuitive, but we'll actually dig deeper into some of these concepts and maybe even terminology in a little bit. But first, it is important to understand why we do it in the first place and the origins of the theory. Why do we learn about theory in the first place for things like PEO, MoHo? Same applies for the therapeutic use of self, right? So don't click off and skip this part just because you just heard a definition, because you'll be doing yourself a lot of injustice and a lot of your clients and their family members a lot of injustice too. This is really important because it's a foundation of knowledge as a therapist. It's kind of like our DNA, like our nature. Then how we actually practice the therapeutic use of self is like saying nature and nurture. It's how we put it into practice in our actual interactions and what we do for engaging in occupations. The definition that you just heard, that commonly accepted one, actually builds on an earlier work from counselors and the psychologists and psychotherapists. And it's based on the concept that therapists can deliberately adapt their responses to enhance therapy. As therapists such as OTs work with one client or more, such as in a group, the interaction is kind of seen as a two-way streak, two-way communication. I'd argue that this would be even the case if the patient was in a coma, because they would communicate non-verbally to you, right? Technically, then this phenomenon or way of interacting is not new to humans in society. We as humans from our early ancestors likely used some form of communication in language before we developed the actual speaking words. Even newborns who haven't developed verbal language are believed to interact with some of their behaviors with their caregivers, such as their mother or father or whoever it may be. What is kind of unique to therapists such as OTs, though, is that we blend all of these kind of concepts with our narrative reasoning, clinical reasoning, or actually professional reasoning is kind of the term that's what we're using these days, because we're not only working in the clinic. And it's essentially what we do for critical thinking in our practice. Take, for example, a client who is new to OT, right? And they're unfamiliar with it, what we do, and they think we're trying to get them a job or something. Or rather, many clients think that way. They may be instantly disinterested in both us and in the therapy session already. Early OTs like Kielhofner believe that the therapeutic use of self can help clients, such as one who is disinterested, to actually engage in occupation. Notice that I did not say engage in therapy, like the therapy session, but in occupation itself. After all, it's occupational therapy. So instead of thinking one-on-one talk therapy, although we kind of do this, like how psychotherapists may do this, what is special about OT is the actual doing of occupations. So these early OTs viewed this concept as engagement in actual activities or occupations, like for example, gardening, with the OT instilling more confidence and acting as a guide throughout the process. The therapeutic use of self has also been emphasized to be 1, conscious, 2, planned, and 3, intentional. So conscious makes sense. You may be familiar with the concept of transference or countertransference, like in psychotherapy, which is when the client or therapist unknowingly or unconsciously transfers their feelings onto the other party. But transference is not the same as therapeutic use of self, though, as the latter is believed to be conscious and even planned. The opposite of planned can be thought of as impulsive, being impulsive. Okay, now what about intentional? This word may not seem like a big deal, and as a student, you may be tempted to kind of glaze over it. So let's take a deep breath, refocus our attention, and re-anchor ourselves, especially if you're starting to get distracted, because it's very important that you refocus your attention on this word with intention, no pun intended. There is even a whole model built on this concept of intention called the Intentional Relationship Model, what I'll abbreviate as IRM in this video, by Taylor in 2008, that is considered to be one of the theoretical influences of therapeutic use of self. Remember how the interactions are two-way, right, between humans, therapists and clients or clients? In IRM, one component is that they describe the therapeutic use of self as this exact thing, and it emphasizes the importance of building a strong relationship as a foundation for successful therapy. Key attributes of IRM, don't forget this, are 1, the client, 2, the therapist, 3, the interaction between them, like I just mentioned, and actually, 4th one, quite intuitive already, but not to forget about it, is occupation, engagement in occupation. Some key elements of IRM will already sound familiar from earlier definitions that we learned about that you'll see parallels with. And these include things like rapport, empathy, collaboration, respect, genuineness, and encouragement. Okay, so these keywords make sense as well in these themes, but what the therapist should be aware of is their self-discipline, core values, ethics, cultural competence based on how the client defines what a successful relationship is. In other words, keep your head before heart. So that's kind of like the theme for IRM when it comes to the influences of the therapeutic use of self and how we should be practicing it anyways. And remember that the I in IRM stands for intentional. The word intentionality under IRM is defined as the exertion of physical, behavioral, emotional, psychological, and interpersonal impulse control during a client interaction, all the while maintaining emotional congruity in all forms of communication, verbal or nonverbal. So then, the key concept to distill from intentionality and its definition are impulse control and then its effect on communication. Therefore, IRM provides a structure for how therapists should foster a strong therapeutic relationship to ultimately just help the client achieve their personal goals in therapy through occupation and promote a positive change in their lives. But you already know how it's just a simple breakdown of communication can affect things like our relationships with our family members, our collaboration with our colleagues, or in this case, the same goes with our clients. Empathy is communication. And even empathy isn't good 100% of the time, as too much of it can be bad. Let me tell you why. Empathy can compromise a therapeutic relationship, such as it resulting in OT losing sight of their boundaries and it affecting how they think and feel, but more importantly, how they behave with their client. It's kind of like how a general rule of why a doctor should not be treating their own family member as a patient. Reiterating again the theme of impulse control, examples of things to be cognizant of and have impulse control for during client interactions include things like physical proximity to the client, how close you are. You can't be all up in their personal space, right? Your facial expressions and nonverbal language, such as crossing your arms or looking bored, to even emotional impulse control. You probably should hold it together and not go full on tears every time you hear a sad story from a client, or look annoyed or irritated or offended to your actual behaviors themselves during our interactions. And of course, the things you say as well, communication. You shouldn't react to everything to the client or say something offensive intentionally either. Why not? Well, that one's kind of obvious, but because you want to be there to support the client, build a safe space, and you can't be crying and end up having the client manage you, have you become the client, for your emotions and be handing you a tissue or something, right? You're the practitioner. And to make things more challenging, and why this is kind of called more of an art, is it happens all in real time on the fly, as you're doing everything else with the client in therapy even. By the way, the science part, it includes the theory and the statistics, like I mentioned earlier, of the evidence-based research, but also much more should be done as well to support what we do as therapists and using the therapeutic use of self. But of course, we are all human, right? We're not all perfect. It's called a practice and just what we should strive for when it comes to therapeutic use of self and the concepts like impulse control. Aside from intention, the IRM also stresses that OTs, 1, be open, 2, reliable, and 3, trusting, so that other models actually and methods like, PEO, MOHO, Kawa can be applied in conjunction to achieve engagement in occupations. So I think that's really, really cool because we probably don't do that already. We're using the therapeutic use of self, but that's not our only framework or model. We're kind of using it in conjunction with other things. And it may also be tempting to try, despite our good intentions, to change a way that the client thinks, feels, or behaves. For example, and this is controversial, say a parent wishing their child, the client with autism, to reduce stimming by essentially masking their behaviors. So it is important that we remain true to the client, such as the autistic child. And notice, by the way, that I mentioned and used the phrase autistic child instead of child with autism, because the community overwhelmingly agrees that we use this identity first language for this condition. And by being also open and maintaining their trust. Because even if something like transference, if you think about it, and countertransference can be detrimental to therapy by being an unconscious phenomenon, imagine what negative conscious and intentional effort can do to compromise the therapeutic relationship between client and therapist. And it's not like we don't want change in general. It's that it's required too, to some degree, to bring about client outcomes and to help them reach their goals. But we want to be careful about what we are changing at the same time, if that makes sense. For example, the autistic child's behaviors changing is a good example of, I would argue, poor therapeutic use of self because it's not client-centered. And the research is now showing that autistic adults to be highly correlated with having things like PTSD, being suicidal, with many advocates who are themselves neurodivergent speaking out against their early therapy, such as ABA, for things like masking their true identity. Although therapeutic use of self means change, should we be changing the client, i.e. the autistic client, when we could be focusing instead on, say, the environment or the occupation itself? And this can be tough. Now, you can see when it comes to therapeutic use of self, it's not so straightforward. The autistic community, on one hand, thinks that should be the case. Meanwhile, parents may be thinking the opposite. I bring this example up because, one, this is a major appeal to most of you as students and OTs working in pediatrics with kiddos, and autism is quite common in OT, but also where the conflicts and ethics come up for the therapeutic use of self, which make practicing it not so straightforward after all, despite the definition and concepts and theory may seem so, but application in real world, not so straightforward, right? And this is why therapeutic use of self is so important, because if we do it wrong, it ends up negatively affecting the client in some way that we may not even know. Remember, do no harm? And this applies to mental health as well, the therapy in their engagement in occupations, and ultimately them reaching their outcomes. And yet another way to think of therapeutic use of self, just to help explain it better to you guys, based on the IRM, is it's the extent that the therapist thoroughly applies their empathy and intentionality in practice, particularly during challenging interactions or situations, is when I would say it's harder. Our goal is not to judge or to change the client, but to understand them at a human level so that we can help them to reach their goals. And I find the IRM actually very interesting and practical, even because in the literature and the research, even applications for this with things like promoting your own self-care as a therapist, building your own resilience, and preventing burnout, a very hot topic these days, not only for OTs, but also in healthcare. So how will you know that you are actually even practicing therapeutic use of self correctly? One approach is to consider the underlying purpose of what you are intentionally doing. We kind of do this already in our daily social interactions by changing how we communicate on the fly. However, for clients such as those who are artistic, they may struggle in this area, such as with reading social cues or even mistaking verbal language, or by things like not understanding sarcasm, for example. These shifts in our interactions on the day-to-day is just one type of the therapeutic use of self called changing our therapeutic modes as needed on the fly. Modes are essentially communication styles with the intention behind it. And in fact, the 6 therapeutic modes of IRM include advocating mode, collaborating mode, empathizing mode, encouraging mode, instructing mode, and problem-solving mode. An acronym for you to remember this is APEACE. This can be very helpful for new therapists, by the way, to have in the back of their mind, besides that empathy part, but that is actually part of one of them, so that it can kind of guide you to remain balanced and not, say, be overly empathetic, but using that APEACE, the other components of it. It is also important to apply what we learned so far in hypothetical situations for you to kind of think about. I'll be kind of like really brief. I'll make more future videos about this. Therapeutic use of self could be easy to really put in practice when things are going well. Let's say you're joking around with your client and they're responding positively. There's a lot of banter and they're engaging in your activity that they want to do. But what about when stuff hits the fan? For example, in situations when boundaries are blurred, coercion, aggression, sharing of bad news. What happens if a client asks you on a date? How you behave, how you act from that point forward is actual part of therapeutic use of self. In pediatrics, a client may run up to you and hug an OT, right? That actually might be quite common. A client becomes embarrassed and fearful. What do you do? Or the OT says something that offends the client, a joke that may not be found funny, a client rejecting the OT suggestion for an activity or a goal. What do you do then? Or the compounded, unresolved tension from previous interactions in a future session. There's no right answer in each situation, I don't think, because if it even comes down to two OTs to react in the same situation, they may be kind of different because, for example, they may have different personalities, they may have different impulse control, experiences, and so on. Or let's say a client just straight out refuses therapy. Should you bribe or coerce patients into engaging in therapy, even though it's probably good for them? Right? This is actually a common barrier that therapists experience in acute care, right? So how would you apply the therapeutic use of self in those scenarios when the lines of good intention and ethics blur? You may already know this, maybe not, but it's the theme of this video, right? The answer is actually that through the therapeutic use of self is how therapists can promote engagement in meaningful occupations, client-centered. So learning about the client on a human interpersonal level to understand them and then find a path clinically through reasoning and the personality and empathy and all those other things we talked about so far in the have defined to actually engage the client in occupations in situations of like refusal. And the therapeutic use of self can be used in all areas. I haven't talked about this, but you should know that can be applied in all areas of practice, not just mental health, not just pediatrics, but even adults all the way to the end of life. The last thing I kind of glossed over though, that the OTPF made it a point to mention, builds on this point too. They mentioned that clients bring their own life experiences, knowledge, and dreams for the future. I would argue even a newborn or someone on hospice on the other end do as well. Therapists should also build an inclusive environment such as gender-affirming care, acknowledge systemic issues such as racism. For example, if you are a white female occupational therapist or occupational therapy assistant seeing a, Hispanic male patient who doesn't speak English, think about how the therapeutic use of self may be different than working with a white lady. Cultural humility. We cannot pretend that the systemic, cultural, historic, basically everything in between, these issues are invisible, especially as we, the therapists, come by default in a position of power. By breaking down these invisible barriers, maybe even addressing them with our clients with humility, we can show our clients that we also are human. But with the power of the therapeutic relationship and the therapeutic use of self, we can be very effective therapeutic allies with our clients. This is where the science meets art for OT, not just at the individual level, but remember, groups and populations to potentially bring about justice and to help people out. But remember that the therapeutic use of self is a skill in a practice. One way my professor defined it in a lecture is the therapeutic use of self can be seen as being and using oneself as an agent of change. And change can be hard for all of us. Think about how it may be for our clients. You can't just learn about it, by the way, this practice and from like watching this video and reading about it, maybe in the lecture, and then expect to have perfected it either, right? You all probably know that. So be patient with yourself. The more you do it, the better you get. But that's only as long as you reflect on your experiences and learn from them too and your mistakes. In terms of research and outcomes, how do you even know that you're doing a good job of using therapeutic use of self? So along those lines, perhaps patient satisfaction surveys or something may be a direct measure of this. If based on the existing research of like surveys, therapeutic use of self, and probably a lot of people and therapists, educators will say that it is an important concept for practice because it can affect change for the positive, then why aren't we measuring it to improve our overall OT workforce to benefit our clients, the groups in the populations. I've seen some of the research look at OT knowledge and attitudes, but not so much of the client's perceptions of our approach to therapy in OT through that therapeutic use of self. So something to think about. So I really hope this helps. In future videos, I plan to come up with some hypothetical cases to kind of apply this therapeutic use of self and the components of it, because there is kind of a lot to it, to make sure that you guys really understand it. So be sure to like this video if it has helped you, subscribe, all that good stuff if you haven't already. And I spent a lot of time researching this topic, so if you're really interested in it, I'll include in the video description all the citations that I have, and there's a lot of actually good books out there and chapters within OT books to check out as well. So thanks for watching. I'm Jeff, the OT Dude. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.